When I walked up the steps of the Chicago Federal Courthouse that Tuesday morning, I had no idea I was about to become the center of the most shocking courtroom reversal in American legal history. My name is Kesha Williams, and for the past 23 years, I've served as a federal judge in this very building. But on this particular morning, dressed in casual clothes and carrying my briefcase, I was about to discover what it feels like to be on the other side of the system I've dedicated my life to serving. The autumn air was crisp as I approached the main entrance at 8:47 a.m. I always arrived early, preferring the quiet moments before the courthouse filled with lawyers, defendants, and the daily drama of justice. My coffee was still warm in my travel mug, and I was mentally reviewing the day's docket when Officer Martinez stepped into my path. "Hold it right there," he barked, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon. "Where do you think you're going?" I paused, surprised by his aggressive tone. I'd seen Martinez around the courthouse for years, though we'd never been formally introduced. He was young, maybe early 30s, with a kind of rigid posture that screamed authority complex. "Good morning, officer." "I'm heading to work," I replied calmly, adjusting my briefcase handle. "I'm Judge Williams." Martinez let out a harsh laugh that echoed off the courthouse steps. "Judge Williams. Lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but Judge Williams is a distinguished white gentleman in his 70s. Nice try, though." The confusion hit me like a physical blow. Of course, he was thinking of Judge Harold Williams from the civil court down the street. A simple misunderstanding, easily corrected. "No, officer, I think there's been a confusion. I'm Judge Kesha Williams, federal court, this building. Let me show you my ID," but Martinez wasn't listening. His face had hardened into something cold and dangerous. "Federal court. You. Look at yourself, lady. You look like you're here for a sentencing, not to pass one." The casual cruelty of his words stung, but what happened next would be seared into my memory forever. Without warning, Martinez grabbed my wrist with such force that my briefcase flew from my hand, legal documents scattering across the courthouse steps like confetti in the wind. "People like you," he snarled, twisting my arm behind my back, always trying to scam the system, always lying about who you are. The metal handcuffs bit into my wrists as he slammed me against the cold stone wall of the courthouse. The same courthouse where I'd presided over thousands of cases, where my portrait hung in the hall of distinguished jurists, where my nameplate read "The Honorable Judge Kesha Williams" on the door of my chambers just 200 feet away. "I am Judge Williams," I gasped, the words barely audible as his forearm pressed against my throat. "Check my ID. Call the courthouse administration. This is a mistake." Martinez leaned closer, his breath hot against my ear. "The only mistake here is you thinking you could walk into a federal building and pretend to be someone important. We know your type, always playing the victim, always claiming to be something you're not." Other officers had gathered now, drawn by the commotion. Officer Rodriguez approached with his phone out, recording what he clearly thought was going to be an entertaining arrest video for their group chat later. "What's the story, Martinez?" Rodriguez called out, grinning. "Got another one trying to impersonate a federal official." Martinez replied loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Claims she's a judge. Can you believe that?" The laughter that erupted from the group of officers felt like glass shards in my chest. These were men whose salaries were paid by the same system I served, whose authority derived from the same constitution I'd sworn to uphold. And they were treating me like a criminal because they couldn't imagine that someone who looked like me could occupy a position of power, ma'am. "You have the right to remain silent," Martinez began, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he pushed me toward the police car that had materialized as if from nowhere. "Though I'm sure you'll keep talking anyway. Your type always does." As I was forced into the back of the patrol car, my eyes found the bronze plaque near the courthouse entrance, "Equal Justice Under Law." The irony was so thick it was suffocating. Through the car window, I could see my scattered legal documents, case files I'd been reviewing, briefs I'd been considering, the daily evidence of a career spent in service of justice, now being swept up by courthouse maintenance like worthless trash. The ride to the police station was a blur of humiliation. Officers Rodriguez and Thompson followed in a second car, their radio chatter full of jokes about my delusions of grandeur and speculation about what drugs I might be on. To think I could pass for a federal judge, but here's what they didn't know. In my 23 years on the bench, I developed something more powerful than anger, more useful than outrage. I'd learned the value of patience, the power of observation, and the absolute certainty that truth, like water, always finds a way to surface. As we pulled into the police station, I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning justice. And in about 6 hours, these officers were going to learn the difference between the two. The processing room at the Chicago Police Department's 12th district was exactly what you'd expect: fluorescent lights that made everyone look sickly, the smell of stale coffee and fear, and the kind of institutional beige paint that seemed designed to crush hope. Martinez shoved me into a metal chair across from a scarred wooden desk, my handcuffs clinking against the chair back. The sound echoed in the small room like a metronome counting down to disaster. Nay, Martinez barked, pulling out a form with the enthusiasm of someone about to enjoy himself. Kesha Williams, I replied evenly. Real name? He emphasized, his pen hovering over the paper like a weapon. Kesha Diane Williams. Martinez looked up with theatrical exasperation. Lady, we're going to be here all day if you keep playing games. What's your actual name? The one on your real ID, not whatever fantasy you're living in. I spoke slowly, clearly, the way I would address a defendant who was clearly in over their head. Officer Martinez, my legal name is Kesha Diane Williams. I am 52 years old. I live at 1247 Lakeshore Drive, apartment 3B. I have served as a federal judge for this district for 23 years. My chambers are on the 4th floor of the building where you arrested me, and my federal identification number is enough. Martinez slammed his pen down so hard it left a mark on the desk. You know what your problem is? You people think if you say something confidently enough, we'll just believe it. Like we're stupid. Like we don't know the difference between a federal judge and a key. He paused, searching for the cruelest word he could find. ... and whatever you are. Okay, the whatever you are hit differently than the rest. It wasn't just about my appearance or my race, it was about Martinez's fundamental inability to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought power looked like. In his world, authority came in a specific package, and I didn't fit the mold. Officer Thompson entered the room, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing a smirk that suggested he'd been looking forward to this show. How's our celebrity judge doing? He asked, settling into a chair like he was at the movies. She's sticking to her story, Martinez replied. Claims she lives on Lakeshore Drive. Apparently, being a federal judge pays better than I thought. Both men laughed, but their laughter had an edged and nervous energy of people who were beginning to realize they might be in deeper water than they'd anticipated. You know what I think? Thompson leaned forward, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. I think she cased the courthouse, learned some names, some details. Planning some kind of scam, maybe identity theft. These people are getting more sophisticated. The casual racism was breathtaking in its audacity. These officers weren't just power drunk, they were performing their prejudice for each other, each trying to outdo the other in creative ways to dismiss my humanity. But then Thompson said something that made my blood run cold. Martinez, you know, we're going to have to write this up, right? Full report, body cam footage, the works. Cover all our bases. Already ahead of you, Martinez replied, pulling out his phone. Weird thing though, my body cam malfunctioned this morning. Total equipment failure. Sometimes these things happen, you know? The two men exchanged a look that spoke volumes. This wasn't their first time crafting a narrative to cover their mistakes. This was a practiced routine, polished by repetition. Lucky thing we had witnesses, Thompson added. Other officers saw the whole thing. Saw how aggressive she got when you tried to question her. How she resisted arrest. I watched this performance with the detached fascination of someone witnessing a masterclass in institutional corruption. They were constructing an alternative reality in real time, complete with corroborating witnesses and convenient equipment failures. Officer Martinez, I said quietly, my voice cutting through their plotting. Before you file that report, I need you to understand something. Both men turned to look at me, surprised that I'd been listening so carefully. In my 23 years on the federal bench, I've presided over exactly 437 cases involving police misconduct. I've seen every lie, every excuse, every creative interpretation of events that officers use to justify excessive force. Martinez's confident smirk faltered slightly. I've heard about malfunctioning body cameras 6 dozen times. I've listened to testimony about suspects becoming suddenly aggressive for no apparent reason 212 times. I've reviewed police reports where multiple officers somehow witnessed identical suspicious behavior 318 times. The room had gone very quiet. And in every single one of those cases, Officer Martinez, I knew exactly what really happened. Because the truth has a weight to it, a consistency, a logic that lies simply can't replicate, no matter how many people agree to tell them. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. What are you trying to say, lady? I looked him directly in the eyes, my voice as steady as granite. I'm saying that in about 4 hours, you're both going to be sitting in my courtroom. And when that happens, we're going to discover together what the consequences are for lying under oath to a federal judge. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since this nightmare began, doubt crept into their expressions. Not certainty, not yet, but the first tiny crack in their wall of arrogance. Martinez recovered first, his voice louder than necessary. More threats. Thompson, add that to the report. Subject continued to make threatening statements toward law enforcement personnel. But I could see it in his eyes. The moment when bravado begins to wrestle with fear. The instant when what if starts to poison confidence. Outside, Chicago went about its Tuesday morning, business commuters rushing to work. Coffee shops serving their regular customers. The ordinary world spinning on its axis. But inside this processing room, something extraordinary was beginning to unfold. The moment when absolute power met immovable truth. And the collision was about to reshape everything. The holding cell at the 12th District was exactly what you'd expect from a municipal building that hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. Concrete walls painted that particular shade of green that seemed designed to induce depression. A metal bench that was either too hot or too cold depending on the season. And the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they were dying of something incurable. I sat on that bench for 3 hours, listening to the rhythm of the police station around me. Officers coming and going, the distant sound of phones ringing, the occasional burst of laughter from the break room. The sounds of people doing their jobs completely unaware that their colleagues had just made. The kind of mistake that ends careers and launches federal investigations. But I wasn't thinking about revenge. After 23 years on the federal bench, you learn that revenge is amateur hour. Revenge is emotional, temporary, satisfying for about 5 minutes, and then forgotten. Justice, on the other hand, is eternal. Justice has consequences that ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, creating change that lasts generations. At 11:43 a.m., Martinez returned with a clipboard and an expression that suggested he was still convinced he was the star of his own hero story. All right, Williams, he said, deliberately omitting any title or courtesy. Time to transport you to courthouse for arraignment. You ready to face some real consequences for your little performance this morning? I stood slowly, smoothing down my now wrinkled clothes with as much dignity as handcuffs would allow. Officer Martinez, I'm curious about something. He paused, clearly not expecting conversation. In your police report, how did you describe my behavior during the arrest? Martinez's chest puffed up with pride. Aggressive, non-compliant, making false claims about identity. Attempting to gain unauthorized access to federal property, resisting lawful detention, and my emotional state. Belligerent, argumentative, typical of someone caught in a lie. I nodded thoughtfully. That's interesting, because I've been sitting here for 3 hours thinking about how I'm going to explain this morning to the media. How I'm going to describe the officers involved when reporters ask for details. The first flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Martinez, in about 1 hour, I'm going to be standing in front of Judge Harrison. That's Judge Robert Harrison. Been on the bench for 15 years. Good man. Plays golf with my husband, and Judge Harrison is going to ask me to explain why I'm being arraigned in my own courthouse. Martinez's clipboard trembled almost imperceptibly. When I tell him that story, when I explain how officers of the Chicago Police Department arrested a federal judge for the crime of walking to work while black. Well, ... I paused, letting the weight of reality settle between us. That's going to be a very interesting conversation. You're still playing this game? Martinez's voice cracked slightly on the word game. Officer Martinez, let me ask you something. In your 5 years with CPD, have you ever arrested a federal judge before? No, but have you ever even met a federal judge before? Well, no, not exactly. But, so you have no experience whatsoever with what a federal judge looks like, sounds like, or how they might behave when falsely arrested by their own police force. The logic was starting to penetrate his wall of assumptions, and I could see the exact moment when genuine fear began to replace bravado. Here's what's going to happen. Martinez, I continued, my voice taking on the tone I usually reserved for sentencing hearings. In 45 minutes, we're going to walk into that courthouse together. You're going to escort me to arraignment, confident that you've caught a criminal trying to impersonate a federal official. Martinez was listening now, really listening, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. And then, Martinez, you're going to discover what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. Except in this case, you're not the unstoppable force. You're just a man who made assumptions based on what you thought power was supposed to look like. The transport van ride to the courthouse was the longest 15 minutes of Martinez's career, though he didn't know it yet. I could see him in the front seat, checking his phone repeatedly, probably Googling Federal Judge Kesha Williams, and slowly realizing that his certainty was built on quicksand. Thompson rode in the passenger seat, equally quiet, both men beginning to understand that they were trapped in a scenario that was about to spiral completely beyond their control as we pulled up to the courthouse. My courthouse, the building where I'd spent more than 2 decades of my life, I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not vindication, but something more powerful. The absolute certainty that justice was about to unfold exactly as it should. The media was already there, drawn by the unusual spectacle of a federal judge being arrested at her own workplace. Cameras flashed as Martinez helped me out of the van, my handcuffs glinting in the afternoon sun. Judge Williams, a reporter called out, "Can you comment on the circumstances of your arrest?" Martinez froze, literally stopped moving, his hand still on my arm, as the reality of what the reporter had just said penetrated his consciousness. Judge Williams, the reporter repeated, "How do you respond to allegations that you were trespassing on federal property?" I turned to look at Martinez, and in his eyes I saw the exact moment when his world began to collapse. The moment when "what if she's telling the truth" became "oh God, she is telling the truth." "Officer Martinez," I said quietly, "just between the two of us, are you beginning to understand the magnitude of your mistake?" His hand was shaking now, visibly shaking. As the implications cascaded through his mind, like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. "Welcome to my courthouse, Officer Martinez. Let me show you how justice really works." The arraignment courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread through the legal community like wildfire. Judge Kesha Williams had been arrested at her own courthouse, and now she was about to be arraigned by a colleague. Lawyers, court reporters, clerks, and law students filled every available seat, drawn by the unprecedented nature of what they were about to witness. Judge Robert A. Harrison took the bench at exactly 2:15 p.m., his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes reflecting the surreal nature of the situation. Bob Harrison and I had served together for over a decade. We'd collaborated on court administration, shared coffee during breaks, and attended each other's family gatherings. Now, he was being asked to arraign me as a criminal defendant. "The court calls the case of People versus Kasha Williams," the clerk announced, her voice betraying the awkwardness everyone in the room was feeling. I stood at the defendant's table, still in handcuffs, still wearing the casual clothes I'd put on that morning for what should have been an ordinary day of judicial service. Behind me, I could hear the whispered conversations of lawyers and reporters trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen, a competent attorney I'd worked with many times. "The defendant is charged with criminal trespass, disorderly conduct, and impersonating a federal official." Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly at the last charge. "Impersonating a federal official." "Yes, Your Honor." According to the arresting officer's report, the defendant claimed to be federal Judge Kesha Williams while attempting to gain unauthorized access to the federal courthouse. The irony was so profound that several people in the gallery let out involuntary sounds of disbelief. Judge Harrison looked down at me with an expression that clearly said, "Kesha, what the hell is happening here?" "Officer Martinez," Judge Harrison called out, "please approach the bench and explain the circumstances of this arrest." Martinez walked forward on unsteady legs. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. He looked like a man walking to his own execution, which, in a professional sense, he was. "Officer Martinez," Judge Harrison began, his tone carefully controlled, "I want you to look very carefully at the defendant and tell this court, are you absolutely certain about the identity of the person you arrested?" Martinez looked at me, really looked at me for the first time all day. And in that moment, standing in the courtroom where I'd presided over thousands of cases, wearing the clothes I'd been arrested in, but carrying the unmistakable authority that comes from years of judicial service, the last of his denial crumbled away. Martinez began, then stopped. "Your Honor, I believed at the time that ... "Officer Martinez," Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice taking on an edge that everyone in the courtroom recognized as judicial displeasure. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, sir." "You're Judge Harrison." "And how do you know that?" "Because you're sitting on the bench, sir, wearing robes. It's your courtroom, I see. And if I were to leave this courtroom, change into casual clothes, and walk down the street, would you still know I was a judge?" Martinez was sweating now, visible beads of perspiration forming on his forehead despite the courthouse air conditioning. "I might not recognize you immediately, sir." "Exactly. So it's possible, isn't it, Officer Martinez, that a federal judge might not be immediately recognizable when dressed in civilian clothes?" The courtroom was dead silent, everyone hanging on every word of this extraordinary exchange. "Yes, sir, that's possible." Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly. "Officer Martinez, I've known Judge Kesha Williams professionally for over 10 years. Would you like me to confirm her identity for the record?" And there it was. The moment when fantasy crashed headfirst into reality, when prejudice met its match in undeniable truth. Martinez's voice came out. It's barely a whisper. "That won't be necessary." "Your Honor." "I'm sorry, Officer Martinez, but I don't think the court heard you clearly. Could you repeat that?" "I said that won't be necessary, Your Honor." Louder this time, but with the tone of a man whose world was disintegrating in real time. Judge Harrison turned to the prosecutor. "Ms. Chen, given the circumstances that have just come to light, how does the state wish to proceed?" Sarah Chen, to her credit, responded immediately. "Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges and requests that Judge Williams be released immediately." The bailiff moved toward me with keys to remove the handcuffs, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom before these restraints are removed, "I'd like to make a statement for the record." Judge Harrison nodded. "The court recognizes Judge Williams." I turned to face the packed gallery, my eyes moving from the reporters scribbling frantically in their notebooks to the lawyers watching with amazement to Martinez. who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. This morning, I experienced something that happens to countless Americans every day. I was judged not by my character, my qualifications, or my actions, but by assumptions based on my appearance. I was treated as less than human because someone couldn't. Imagine that a person who looks like me could hold a position of authority. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear people breathing. But I am one of the fortunate ones. I have a platform, a voice, and the power to demand accountability. Most people who experience what I experience today don't have those advantages. Most people who are wrongfully arrested, brutalized, or humiliated by those sworn to protect and serve have no recourse. No voice, no power to demand justice. I paused, letting that reality settle over the room. So while I will pursue appropriate legal remedies for what happened to me today, I want everyone in this courtroom to remember that my experience is not unique. It's just unusual that someone with my position was on the receiving end of it. I turned to look directly at Martinez, who was now openly crying. "Officer Martinez, I don't hate you. I don't even entirely blame you. You are the product of a system that taught you to see people like me as threats rather than fellow human beings. But ignorance is no longer an excuse, and good intentions don't erase harmful actions." The weight of absolute moral authority filled my voice as I delivered my final words. Today, you learn that justice doesn't care about your assumptions. Truth doesn't bend to your prejudices. And power doesn't always look the way you expect it to. I nodded to the bailiff, who removed my handcuffs with hands that shook slightly from the gravity of the moment. "Your Honor," I said to Judge Harrison, "I request a 15-minute recess so I can retrieve my judicial robes from my chambers. I have a docket to attend to." As I walked out of that courtroom, the silence behind me was deafening. The silence of people witnessing the kind of moment that changes everything. When truth finally speaks with a voice too powerful to ignore. The walk to my chambers had never felt longer or more meaningful. Court security cleared the hallways as word spread throughout the building. Judge Williams was returning to her bench. Staff members lined the corridor, clerks, bailiffs, attorneys, court reporters, people I'd worked with for years, all watching with a mixture of relief, pride, and amazement as I made my way to the elevator. My chambers were exactly as I'd left them that morning. Case files neatly stacked on my desk. Legal briefs marked with my handwritten notes. The daily schedule that had been interrupted by hatred and ignorance, but would now resume with renewed purpose. The familiar weight of my judicial robes felt different as I put them on, not just a symbol of authority, but a reminder of responsibility when I returned to the courtroom 20 minutes later. The scene had completely transformed. The media presence had tripled, with national news crews setting up equipment in the hallway. The gallery was packed with federal judges, attorneys, city officials, and civil rights leaders who had rushed to the courthouse as word of the morning's events spread throughout Chicago's legal community. But most significantly, Officer Martinez was no longer alone at the prosecutor's table. He was flanked by union representatives, internal affairs investigators, and lawyers whose expressions suggested they understood exactly how catastrophic this situation had become for the Chicago Police Department. "All rise," the bailiff announced as I entered the courtroom. The Honorable Judge Kesha Williams presiding. The words had never sounded more powerful. As I took my place behind the bench in my courtroom. Wearing my robes, I could see the full magnitude of the morning's events reflected in every face before me. "Please be seated," I said, my voice carrying the authority of 23 years of judicial service. "Before we address any other matters, I want to ensure that Officer Martinez fully understands the legal implications of what occurred today." Martinez stood, his union representative beside him, both men looking like they were facing a firing squad. "Officer Martinez, you arrested a sitting federal judge on fabricated charges. You filed a false police report. You committed perjury during your initial testimony. You violated my civil rights under color of law, which is a federal felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison." The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of reporters' pens capturing every word. More importantly, Officer Martinez, you demonstrated a pattern of behavior that suggests this was not an isolated incident. Your immediate resort to violence, your casual use of racial language, your coordinated effort to fabricate evidence. With your fellow officers, these actions suggest a systematic approach to law enforcement that is both unconstitutional and criminal. Martinez's lawyer leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear. But I wasn't finished. However, Officer Martinez, I am not going to use my position to seek personal revenge. Instead, I am going to use this moment to ensure that what happened to me today never happens to anyone else. I turned to address the packed courtroom. Effective immediately. I am ordering a federal investigation into the arrest procedures and training protocols of the Chicago Police Department. I am requesting that the Department of Justice review all arrests made by Officer Martinez and his colleagues over the past 5 years for patterns of civil rights violations. Implications rippled through the room like a shockwave. Furthermore, I am establishing a civilian oversight committee with subpoena power to investigate complaints of police misconduct in this district. This committee will have the authority to refer cases directly to federal prosecutors, bypassing the local system that has clearly failed to provide adequate accountability. Judge Harrison, who had remained in the courtroom to witness this unprecedented moment, nodded approvingly. Several other federal judges in the gallery were taking notes, recognizing the historic nature of the reforms being announced. Officer Martinez, I continued, you will face criminal charges for your actions today. But more importantly, you and your department will face systemic change designed to prevent future victims from experiencing what I experienced this morning. Martinez finally spoke, his voice barely audible. Your Honor, I want to apologize. I was wrong. I let my assumptions. I made terrible mistakes. Officer Martinez, I interrupted gently. Your apology is noted, but it doesn't erase the harm you caused. It doesn't restore the dignity you attempted to strip away. And it doesn't address the hundreds of other people who have suffered similar treatment at your hands without having the platform to demand justice. I paused, looking directly at him with something that might have been compassion. What your apology does do, Officer Martinez, is acknowledge that change is possible, that people can recognize their mistakes and commit to being better. That's where healing begins, not with forgiveness that costs nothing, but with accountability that changes everything. The sentencing that followed was swift and comprehensive. Martinez faced federal charges that would likely end his career and result in significant prison time. The police department faced federal oversight that would reshape their training, policies, and accountability measures. And the city of Chicago faced a civil rights lawsuit that would cost millions, but more importantly, would establish precedents protecting future victims. But as the courtroom finally began to empty 3 hours later, as reporters rushed to file their stories and lawyers hurried to advise their clients on the implications of what they'd witnessed, I sat alone behind my bench for a few quiet moments. I thought about the morning's journey from victim to vindicator, from powerless to powerful, from humiliated to heard. I thought about all the people who experience what I experienced but never get the chance to put on the judge's robes, never get the opportunity to transform their pain into systemic change. And I made a promise to myself and to them that this moment would not be just about one judge getting justice, but about creating a system where justice is possible for everyone, regardless of what they look like, where they come from, or how much power others think they deserve to wield. Outside, Chicago continued its daily rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted. The rules had changed. The expectations had been reset. And the next time someone assumed that power couldn't look like me, they would remember the day when assumptions met their match in the most powerful force of all, truth, backed by the authority to enforce it. As I finally rose from my bench and headed home that evening, I carried with me the satisfaction that comes not from revenge, but from justice. Not from defeating an enemy, but from changing a system. Not from being right, but from making right possible for everyone who comes after. Sometimes the most powerful robe you can wear is the one that reminds the world that dignity, authority, and justice don't come in the package they expect. Sometimes the most important verdict you can deliver is the one that says, "This stops here. This changes now. This never happens again." And sometimes when the gavel comes down, it echoes not just through one courtroom, but through history itself.